If you are like me, as a data engineer or business intelligence developer, the part you dread the most about any project is having to spend hours creating the documentation. One of my favorite features of EasyMorph is its ability to create detailed documentation in just a couple of clicks. Simply go to the Project tab, click on Generate Documentation, and we see a pop-up window with some options. We'll come back to those. Let's click on Generate, and the documentation is generated as a HTML file and opened in the web browser. The documentation covers every input data source, module, group, table, transformation action, parameter, and output in the project. You can also add the Generate Documentation action at the end of your workflow to automatically generate the documentation each time it runs. Alternatively, it supports creating documentation for other projects, and so if your workflow runs often, generating documentation each time might be pointless. You can instead create a separate workflow to update the documentation at more suitable intervals. To do this, I'll create a new project in EasyMorph, add only a single Generate Documentation action, configure the path to my main project file, and that's it. I can then schedule this workflow using EasyMorph Launcher or EasyMorph Server. Adding more Generate Documentation actions to this workflow allows me to update the documentation for all my projects once a week. Now we've looked at how to generate the documentation, let's take a look at how we can modify it to suit our needs. Firstly, I have an option to move large scripts or text to appendices. This can be particularly useful if my project contains large SQL statements for extracting data from a database. Rather than multiple pages of code appearing in the middle of the documentation, it will be placed at the end and a reference added at the relevant point instead. This option can be set between 5 and 100 rows as needed. This project loads data from a database, and so it does contain a simple SQL statement. Therefore, when generating the documentation, if I set this setting to 5 rows, under the Companies table, we can see a reference to Appendix 1. And if I scroll to the bottom, I can see the appendix containing the code. In EasyMorph, it is possible to add annotations or notes just about every element. These annotations not only help us to remember the business logic or reasoning behind why we built the project, but EasyMorph also includes them in the generated documentation. If we select the States table, we can see that I have already added an annotation describing its purpose. Within the documentation, this annotation is included in the appropriate place. Annotations can be added to a module on the settings bar on the left-hand side within the module's overview. To a workflow group by right-clicking on the Group tab and selecting Annotate. To tables and charts by selecting the table and adding them at the top of the settings bar. To any action by selecting the action and adding them at the top of the action's settings. To connectors by adding them to the Notes field within the connector settings. Or alternatively, by adding a URL to external documentation about the data source setting the URL and the label that should appear in the documentation. And finally, to parameters by adding them to the Notes field under the parameter settings. We can also change the styling of the documentation. This does require writing some HTML and CSS code, but it's not as difficult as you may think. When generating the documentation, I have two tabs available to me. Any HTML added to the Head tab will be added to the bottom of the HTML header element of the documentation. Similarly, any HTML added to the Body tab will be included at the top of the HTML body element. Let's take a look at some examples. Firstly, I want to add my company logo to the top of the documentation. On the Body tab, I can add the HTML image tag to do just this. And when I generate the documentation, my logo is there, although it does look a little large. So let's go back and add some extra styling to fix it. I can also add some extra text in paragraph tags to describe my project in more detail. I also want to style the documentation, making all the headers my corporate color. On the Head tab, I can add CSS styles that will be applied by the web browser. For example, let's make all the level 1, 2, and 3 headers EasyMorph blue. And finally, what if I want to add additional text to the footer of my document? This is a little more tricky, but it can be done using more advanced CSS and its after pseudo element. Within my style, on the Head tab, let's add some additional basic text. There are limitations to what can be added using this method, but one important use case would be to add a copyright notice. All of these modifications and additions can be saved within the project and so will be included every time we manually or automatically generate the documentation. Of course, any workflows run as tasks in EasyMorph Server which contain the generate documentation action will work exactly the same way as they do in EasyMorph Desktop. Additionally, the documentation can also be viewed under the EasyMorph Server task by going to Tasks on the sidebar, selecting the relevant task, and clicking on the Documentation tab. As you can see, the documentation contains all of the same information and styling we've already applied. Importantly, the link to this tab within the task is permanent and so can be used downstream in reporting and BI tools to give users visibility of how the data was sourced and transformed before it reached their dashboards. The workflow doesn't need to include a generate documentation action, as EasyMorph Server takes care of this for us. Hopefully you can see how this simple but powerful feature of EasyMorph can help you document your solutions, keep your business stakeholders happy, and save you large amounts of time in the process.